John Sewell. I'm a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the folks who run it asked me to moderate today, which I was more than happy to do because it's a great program. Let me give you a few organizational words first, just to position where people are coming from, because you all know the Washington adage that where you stand depends upon where you sit, and the Wilson Center, which is the official monument to Woodrow Wilson, set up because Wilson was the first president with a PhD in international relations and a distinguished university president, as well as a governor before he came to the Oval Office. And a research policy center, both nonpartisan and nonprofit, set up in his honor seemed a fitting monument. So it is the official monument, just like the Washington Monument. It's the official monument. The Wilson Center on the Hill program was set up several years ago, run by David Klaus, that distinguished-looking gentleman back there, which is an attempt by the center to bring to congressional audiences unbiased, nonpartisan research and analysis on current issues that you all are going to have to deal with in some sense or another. It's funded by, it runs about 15 or 20 seminar programs a year. It's funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and as you know, if you're on the mailing list, they run a large number of programs. The next one, by the way, is on building infrastructure in Africa, probably Africa's most pressing needs, which will be on April 6th. Am I right, Elizabeth? April 6th. And you can get an invitation to that. And I've been asked to tell you that on your, if you're new to the program, on your table is not a pledge card, I reassure you. But a form on the back to get on the Wilson Center on the Hill mailing list with an ability to pick out the kinds of programs you'd be interested in, so we make sure you get an invitation to them, and you can leave them on your tables, I guess, or give to Elizabeth Byers back there, who runs the program, before you go. I am not going to go into flowery introductions for our speakers, mainly because on the back of your agenda is short bios on each of the people. They each, from different perspectives, have a long experience in dealing with agriculture and world hunger issues in the civil society structure, on the Hill, in and out of government at various times. And they're going to give you a rich but short introduction to the issue, so that we can run a discussion of them in the ensuing period of time. This is on the record. The camera you see back there is neither C-SPAN nor Fox News. It's the Wilson Center feed. It goes out over the Wilson Center webpage, so you can see yourself if you chose to do that. We've changed the order somewhat. Ann Tutler, who's the coordinator for the Feed the Hunger initiative at USDA, the government-wide initiative to build a much more effective food policy, particularly as it affects hunger. She will be followed by Jay Brannigan, who's a senior professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, works for Senator Lugar. If you read his biography, you will see he's also a very distinguished journalist for many years. And finally, it will be Julie Howard, who is Executive Director of the Partnership to Cut Poverty and Hunger in Africa, which is one of Washington's most effective NGOs on bringing these issues both to Congress and the executive branch and to the broader public. So we'll start out with Ann Tutwiler and go on from there, and then we'll open for questions.
Thank you, John, and I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this. When I was at the Hewlett Foundation, Woodrow Wilson Center came to me and with this great idea of starting this seminar series up on the Hill, and I thought it was an excellent way to bring the expertise that the Wilson Center has in its stable to the audience who most needs to hear it in a way that was easy to accept and included lunch. So I appreciate the invitation. what I want to do, can people hear me? Is that working? What I want to do is talk a little bit about the background that led the administration to launch this Feed the Future initiative in terms of the role of hunger and poverty and agricultural-led growth, the long-term supply-demand challenges, the improvements that we felt were needed in the agriculture-related assistance, and then spend a little bit of time talking about the specifics of the Feed the Future initiative. So I'm going to go through the first part of this pretty quickly because I assume most people are familiar with some of these statistics and this information, but I think it's worth setting the table with this. So globally, there are currently 1 billion people who are hungry and malnourished. And I was looking at the tables around here, and many of the tables have 6 people at them. So imagine that this is one person for every 6 people in this room to give you an idea of the impact of this on a global level. While most of us think of the hungry as people who are affected by disasters like the Haiti earthquake or by war like we have in Somalia and Sudan and other places, 90% of these people are chronically hungry. And that means the main cause of their hunger is poverty, the inability to purchase food. So this is a problem of income. It is not a problem generally of food supply. There has been a lot of work done by Julie Howard's group and by others about the fact that agricultural-led growth is the most effective way to increase the incomes, particularly the incomes of the poorest of the poor. There's been some work done, I believe, by the World Bank that indicates that a 1% increase in agricultural-led growth in an economy increases the incomes of the 10% of the poor by 6%. So a lot of percents there, but a 1% increase in agricultural-led growth increases the income of the poorest people in a society by 6%, mainly by lowering food prices for those people who are consumers. We also, yeah, this mic is a little bulky. Is that better? Keeps going in and out. Okay, I'll talk loud. So the other piece of this is that agriculture-led growth is also the most effective means of getting these rural-based economies growing. And part of this is because there's a very large multiplier effect for income in agriculture. So for every dollar of economic growth in agriculture that's generated in rural areas, you get 3 additional dollars of growth because people are buying more farm implements, they're buying more fertilizer, they're buying more seeds, they're transporting their goods, they have increased income to buy more food locally. So it's a very high multiplier effect to increase the incomes of the poor and increase the incomes of the overall economy. And lastly, the food price crisis, which happened in 2008 that we all are aware of, really put agriculture and ag issues on the political radar screen for a lot of leaders. When I was down in Haiti this past summer before the earthquake, the ambassador there, our ambassador there, told me that agriculture had not even been on the Haitian government's radar screen until the food price crisis. Now, this is a country where 60% of the people are employed in agriculture. And that food price crisis, just to make the point, shoved another 100 million people into poverty because they could no longer afford food. So we really saw a strong impact of higher prices. We saw riots in a number of countries. One country's government turned over, and we, of course, saw a big increase in trade barriers, which is a problem for U.S. farmers, not just farmers around the world. So the long-term picture that also led us into our strategy is the prediction that there are going to be 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. And demand is expected to increase by anywhere between 40 and 70%. 40% if there is no economic growth in the rest of the world. That's just driven by sheer population growth and a little bit by income growth in the richer countries. But 70% if there is broad-based economic growth. So this is a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity for farmers around the world. And the reason that this 70% demand growth is there is because when people start getting more income, they start eating more meat. They start eating more vegetable oil. They start eating more fruits and vegetables. So there's a strong increase that for every dollar people get in income in a poor country, they spend about an extra 50 cents on food. Whereas for every extra dollar we get, we spend about 2 cents on food. So a very strong multiplier effect there. We also are seeing a number of supply-side challenges. There are certainly, as we all know, limits on the amount of water we have for agricultural use, competition from urban uses, limits on land. The FAO has estimated that there's about 16% more land that we can bring into production without cutting virgin forests or cutting or moving into protected areas around the world. So only 16% more land. We are seeing climate variability. There are predictions that rice yields may decline by as much as 25% in Southeast Asia and West Africa in 2050 as a result of climate change. And we've also been seeing flattening yields over the last 10 or 15 years in production around the world. So a lot of challenges out there in terms of the long-term picture. There's also recognition when we look at Africa and other places that given the right tools, given the right fertilizer, given the right seeds extension, farmers can increase their productivity, increase their production. So the other piece of what was sort of driving the administration's thinking was a real reassessment of our agricultural development strategy. First of all, there's a recognition that donor-driven assistance, where the U.S. government or the French government, whatever, says this is what we want you to do, that doesn't work. We really have to have the buy-in of the countries into the strategy, into the goals, into what we're trying to accomplish in order for the kinds of investments in development assistance to really, really pay off. The other recognition is that over the last 20 years, there has been declining and insufficient investment in long-term agricultural development, and we felt this was something that needed to be reversed given the challenges I just outlined. Also recognition that the project-based approach to development was not working, that what we needed was a more systemic and comprehensive approach that was taking agriculture from, as we say, from the farm to the fork. So it wasn't just focusing on increasing yields, it wasn't just focusing on trade, but it was focusing on the whole supply chain in agriculture and trying to make improvements there. The other recognition is that we have a real problem with donor coordination at the in-country level. Julie probably has some good numbers on how many meetings certain ministers of agriculture end up having with donors every week. And surprisingly enough, the U.S. government doesn't do a very good job of coordinating within itself. So there was a recognition of a need to better coordinate to reduce fragmentation in aid, duplication, and of course to fill gaps. And finally, a recognition that over the last few years, we have had a very limited monitoring and investment plan. And this has made it very difficult, one, for us to be able to say, here's what we've accomplished with the taxpayer dollars that we've invested in developing countries. And two, it makes it very difficult to say, this approach that we're taking here in this project in this country isn't working very well, and we need to make a mid-course correction. So there was a real recognition of the need to put in place a much stronger monitoring and evaluation system so that we could know what we were accomplishing and where we needed to fix things. So this new approach is called Feed the Future. It is country-led. It relies heavily on country buy-in into the process. And when I say country-led, that does not mean government-led. It means that we have to see a consultation process with civil society, with local farmers groups, local business groups, to make sure this is not just the government's idea of what's needed, but actually has buy-in in the wider economy. It is focused on increasing investment in the agriculture sector. It's a comprehensive approach. It's coordinated, and we are putting in place a robust monitoring and evaluation system. This approach has been adopted by all of the G8 countries, the world's leading economies, as well as the broader group of G20 countries, and as well as the African countries through the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. So this is an approach that's really starting to spread, not just within the U.S., but around the world. President Obama made a commitment as part of this G8, G20 discussion of $3.5 billion to agricultural investment over the next 3 years. Leveraging on that, the other donors have committed to an investment of an additional $17.5 billion over those next 3 years. And we are lining up the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development to monitor those commitments to make sure countries are living up to what they've said they're going to do. We're going to be focusing on 20 countries. So those countries are the ones that have the most highest levels of poverty and malnutrition. Most of them are in Africa, but not all. They'll be in two categories. We're calling one sort of phase one or pre-investment, where they need a lot of assistance in developing a strategy, financing this consultation process. A second group of countries that are further along in their planning and are ready to really have a good technically sound strategic investment plan. There's going to be a higher focus on research and regional integration than we've seen in the past. And we are working in a whole-of-government approach. The State Department, USAID, USDA, and Millennium Challenge Corporation have been working very closely together and developing the strategy and developing an implementation plan. The documents that outline this strategy and implementation plan are very close to being released. The consultation document draft should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. The implementation document, which gives more details about the how, will be a little bit delayed behind that because we're still running through the interagency process, but I think it's also very close. And just to finish on USDA's role in this whole initiative, I think USDA envisions our role as really being able to provide technical expertise to helping to build capacity, particularly among ministries of agriculture, to making the market systems work in developing countries, to providing help with creating policy environments that support the agriculture, to providing help with ministries to set up statistical information services, and last but not least, and I see because one of my colleagues is here from the research area, research and extension. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
And thank you very much. We'll get a view from the Hill from Jay Brannigan.
Okay, great. Thanks. Whoops. Well, my stuff's going to fall off here. How's this? Is this working? In my face. Thanks, Ann. Ann laid out very well a lot of the background that led Senator Lugar to start his own initiative on global food security. I work for Senator Lugar on the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Lugar has been on the Agriculture Committee for his entire time in the Senate, more than 30 years, and he's been on the Foreign Relations Committee nearly as long. So when the food crisis hit back in 2000 and early 2008, 2007, he was ideally placed really to take advantage, or to not take advantage, but to seize this opportunity to really redirect U.S. food policy. So we created some legislation and got cooperation from Senator Casey. And this began actually before the Obama election in 2007, 2008, like in August or so. We drafted our first legislation. So we have watched with interest the administration develop its own policy, and I'm pleased to say that we've been going in parallel for the past year or so, and the good news is that we're not going to collide, we're going to converge, and I think we're going to have a very good, we're very optimistic right now that we're going to have a good link up between what we in Congress are doing and what the administration's been doing. So let me explain to you briefly, many of you know the details, let me explain to you briefly what the Lugar-Casey Global Food Security Act does. First of all, the most important thing it does, it basically lays out that food security is national security or national interest of the United States. It declares that we have a national interest in promoting agricultural development, food security around the world. Secondly, it appoints or seeks to appoint a global food security coordinator for the U.S. government who will coordinate all the global food security policies. This person, he or she, will be in a very high-level position, will develop a global food security strategy, and will seek to implement it through a sort of a unified government approach. As many of you know, our foreign assistance is spread over many agencies, including the Defense Department, the Agriculture Department. 26 or so different agencies in the U.S. government have a piece of the development pie right now, and so this needs to be coordinated from a very high level, and this is why we need a global food security coordinator to do so. And then third, it designates USAID as the lead agency to implement the global food security strategy. One thing that's happened over the years is that USAID lost a lot of funding during the 90s, when we were all collecting the peace dividend. And while the money has come back during the 2000s under the Bush administration, a lot of the personnel and expertise has been lost at USAID. So we have another piece of legislation, but we would like to rebuild the agricultural expertise of the USAID and of other development agencies too. I mean, one of the interesting things that Ann didn't mention is that during after the Green Revolution, during the 90s and the early 2000s, the development community and the donors kind of turned their attention away from supporting agriculture. Food prices were low, and we were kind of lulled into a false sense of security. And we have to rebuild that development infrastructure for agriculture, which has been allowed to kind of wither away over the years. The second part of the bill is the money part. We basically increased the funding substantially over the next. Currently, the bill is for 5 years. Whether it'll stay that long is not clear quite yet. And then third is, and this is really a tangential part of the bill, but it's also an important part. We allocate money, no-year money. Right now, it's about $500 million for emergency food relief. Now, the aim of this bill is for long-term sustainable food growth, but we know we're still going to have food emergencies. And right now, there is a fund at USAID called the International Disaster and Famine Assistance Fund. And this money will go into that fund, but it'll be reserved just for emergency part of food emergencies. The idea is to be able to get the food, get the money out to buy food quickly to prevent a food emergency from becoming a food crisis. This is sort of bridge money in order before the other food programs kick in, Food for Peace and the other World Food Program assistance kicks in. So it's emergency money as opposed to regular emergency money. So that's the bill. It has bipartisan support. It's Lugar-Casey. There's a companion bill on the House side that's been put out by Betty McCollum. That has bipartisan support. Our bill was voted out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by voice vote. We've got Republican and Democratic sponsors. I mean, this is an island of bipartisanship in this current sea of partisanship here in Washington. The two bills are very similar. So, and the House bill has a lot of findings up at the front, and there's some little differences here and there. But we are quite confident that if they both get through, a conference will be a very simple affair. So where do we stand now? The question is, two things let me point out. For those of you that you might want to, have you heard about this bill and might have heard any objections to it, two things have come up. One is sort of a false premise, and the other is it was initially false premise, and there's still some concerns. The first is related to genetically modified organisms. The bill has a big research component, which Senator Lugar really believes in. Senator Lugar is also besides being a farmer himself in Indiana, he's also a Rhodes Scholar. So we have earmarked some special money to rebuild the research facilities from the International Rice Research Institute and all the other international research institutes. And we mentioned in the bill that the research should include research on genetically modified organisms. And this caused a big stir in the environmental blogosphere because people assumed that we were somehow requiring that countries adopt genetically modified technology, or that they would be cut off for funding if they didn't allow genetically modified technology. None of that is true. This bill doesn't change anything about the current funding rules and research rules for genetically modified technology. If a country wants to use it, that's fine. If it doesn't want to use it, if it's not appropriate, that's fine too. So we're going to tweak the language on that so that we can say that the funding is available for advanced technologies, including but not limited to genetically modified organisms, which we think will satisfy most of the objections to this, which I think is, like I say, is largely built on a misunderstanding. The other objection initially came from some of the commodity groups because of the $500 million for purchasing food crops. As most of you here probably know, our Food for Feast program has great support in this country because we buy U.S. surplus grain and U.S. surplus products and ship them overseas. And this is kind of expensive. Sometimes as much as 60 cents in every dollar goes for transportation and other expenses rather than for food. There's some concern initial concern from the commodity groups that this bill would change the current law, which allows for a small amount of local and regional purchase in our food aid programs. This bill doesn't change any of the rules. Once that got cleared up, I think some of the objections went away. The rules are in place. There are still some people who are concerned that this will be kind of the camel's nose under the tent and will prompt more and more local and regional purchase. And that's something I think that has to be worked out. But we think if we limit it just to the emergency part of an emergency where it would be impractical to get U.S. food there anyway, that should assuage the concerns. But we'll have to see. I also should mention, I really apologize. I'll get whipped when I go back to the office. There's one thing that's not in the administration program that is in our bill, is something called the Hectare program, which I can never remember. It's an acronym that we made up, and I can never remember. It's the Higher Education Collaboration for Technology, Agriculture, Research, and Extension Program. And this is an effort to basically transplant the U.S. land-grant college system to foreign countries, using the land-grant colleges themselves and other agriculture research universities in this country. We're trying to, with that program, create good agricultural land-grant extension-type universities in developing countries so that they can develop their own technologies and solve their own technological problems on the farm, just as our land-grant colleges were so important for developing our agriculture in this country. So briefly, I'll just tell you where things stand. As I said, we watched with great interest and were applauded Secretary Clinton when she decided to make food security and ending hunger an important part of her administration. We fully supported her in that. They have been developing their program in parallel with ours. We like almost everything about their program in terms of the fact that it concentrates on the most severely affected countries. Our bill gives a lot of flexibility to the administration to develop a good, effective program, and we think this has a lot of the elements of that. So what we're working with now that Raj Shah is in place at USAID, we are actually starting to work closely together, and we are optimistic or hopeful, and I think optimistic, that within the next several weeks we can come up with basically a consensus bill that we'll have the approval of the House side, the Senate side, and the administration, and go forward with that. If that's successful, we have a hearing on April 22nd, and I think that maybe legislation could be introduced as early as May. So let me explain to you why I think this is important, and then I'll let Julie have her say. If we can get the administration and the Congress fully behind working together to implement this program, you'll have the kind of success, I think, that you had with PEPFAR. If you saw PEPFAR was developed by the Bush administration with the concurrence of the Congress, and it got renewed and was strengthened and was able to continue on a continuous and strong basis. And that's what we need with agriculture. We can't have just a one-shot, short-term, couple-year, 3-year, 5-year program. This has to be sustained. And we believe that if Congress and the administration all work together, Republicans and Democrats, get together behind the principle, behind the bill, behind the program, that it'll be able to have a long-term, sustainable basis and will become an important element of U.S. foreign policy, which is what we think it should be. So I think that that's the importance of this legislation, and that's why we're working very hard, and we're working very hard with the administration to come up with a consensus bill that we think should pass. But thanks for your help.
Jay, thank you very much. Let me turn over to Julie Howard as the cleanup batter, and then we can go to questions from the floor. Julie, you've got 10 minutes.
Okay. Wow. Now I understand the problem.
Yeah, there's no.
Okay. Good. Well, thanks to John and the Wilson Center for inviting me to be a part of this very distinguished panel. I've enjoyed listening to both Ann and Jay. I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about the partnership itself, and then actually switch fairly quickly to some, I have to say, more than hot off the press, some policy recommendations that we're working on that we actually haven't released yet, based on a conference that we held. Some of you, I think, came about 3 weeks ago to the conference we held with U.S. and African partners on priorities for food security. So I'd like to switch fairly quickly into what came out of those discussions. But let me say first, what is the partnership? The partnership was actually formed about a decade ago by a former USAID administrator, Peter McPherson, and several African presidents, President of Mali, Uganda, Ghana. And they started the partnership for the reasons that Ann and Jay both alluded to. Really about a decade, 15 years ago, we really reached a sort of nadir in terms of our funding for agriculture and food security. We went from a high of almost 20% of ODA, official development assistance, in the late 70s going to agriculture to about 3.5% in 2000. So the intention of McPherson and these presidents was to create some kind of independent U.S.-African coalition that could help draw attention back to the importance of agriculture on both continents, the importance of agriculture to sort of fundamentally solve the problems of hunger and poverty over the long term. So I think really what the partnership has helped to do is create a kind of foundation stone for a constituency, a real constituency that has built up around this topic over the last 3 or 4 years, especially since the global food price crisis in 2008. So we haven't acted alone by any means. We've had a lot of support from many of you in the room. But I think as a consequence of that, we've seen a real turnaround on public commitment to agriculture as this long-term solution to food insecurity in both Africa and the U.S. In 2003, African heads of state committed themselves to increasing their investment in agriculture to 10% and committed themselves to reaching agricultural growth rates of 6%. Many of them are approaching those targets now. It's quite impressive. And of course, you heard from both Ann and Jay. I mean, the incredible progress that we've witnessed from both congressional leadership and the U.S. administration leadership over the past couple of years. So the other part of the partnership's interest, of course, in increasing funding and improving the way that we do foreign assistance for food security. We also have been very interested in amplifying the African voice in these discussions. You know, we found as many of you go to these discussions on foreign assistance, and there's an area development country representative in the room, and we really wanted to change that. So we've been working very closely with the diplomatic community here, with officials from public sector, civil society, private sector, trying to bring them into the discussion. And we think that's really changed the debate a lot. About a year ago, just over a year ago, in February 2009, we convened what we were billing then heuristically as our first annual conference of U.S., African, and multilateral representatives. And that conference was to discuss the best ways to make progress on food security given the really terrible world economic environment at that time. And it was kind of really amazing to us that the clear message that came out of that conference was participants called on the U.S. government to shift the locus of decision-making and accountability for foreign assistance from Washington to developing countries themselves. They asked the U.S. government to embrace a demand-driven, African-owned approach to funding and programming food security assistance, which had as its clear objective a lot of the things that Jay talked about, strengthening the foundations for long-term African-led agricultural development and food security. So it really has been interesting over the past few months to see what happened at the G8 meetings, the G20, the World Food Summit in November. That's really led us down this path to a more country-led, region-led approach to development. So we're very proud of that and proud of what the administration and Congress has done to push that along. Okay, so very quickly now onto our more than hot-off-the-press policy recommendations. Well, since we called that the first annual conference last year, we had to have a second annual conference just three weeks ago. And this time our objectives were to understand better what the critical challenges are. What's affecting the U.S. government's ability to more swiftly implement the food security initiative. You know, we're so pleased with this momentum. It seemed to us late last year was beginning to stall a little bit. I'm very concerned about that. So we wanted to talk about what were the specific challenges and what pragmatically could be done to address the challenges. So let me go through quickly just the 7 policy recommendations that are starting to emerge from those discussions. First of all, you know, we heard from the groups who were there, U.S., African, multilateral, really full support on the appropriation side for the President's request for the international budget. About $1.8 billion for international food security, and then the $1.7 billion for food aid programs. Really want to continue the momentum of dramatically scaling up assistance. And I just want to put that in context. This is still a relatively tiny portion of the foreign assistance pie. In 2010, agriculture programming for Africa was less than 2% of global U.S. foreign assistance and less than 10% of the assistance for Africa managed by USAID and state. And by contrast, the health program received 67% of USAID state-managed assistance in 2010. I just think it's important to make that point because you know, we're talking about pretty dramatic increases, but we're also starting from very, very low levels. Okay, quickly through the other policy recommendations. We thought it's important to sustain and build on the momentum you've been hearing about by establishing very clear operational leadership for the Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative. And what do we mean by that? Well, the participants, the partnership thinks that the USAID administrator ought to be named as quickly as possible as Global Food Security Coordinator, and that USAID should be designated as the lead coordinating institution for food security programs in a pioneering approach, a whole-of-government approach that draws on resources across different agencies according to their capacities and in response to priorities established by countries and regions. The third policy recommendation urged the U.S. to pursue organizational innovations that will better integrate U.S. government actions for better effectiveness and flexibility. And this includes provision of support for some of the things that Anne referred to, support for regional organizations to strengthen critical regional economic integration. And I'll go into this in more detail in a second. Fourth recommendation, put monitoring, analysis, evaluation, and learning at the core of the Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative. Notice I'm not just saying monitoring and evaluation. I think as much as demand-driven was the theme of last year's conference, this year's theme was it can't just be monitoring and evaluation. We cannot just be counting widgets and hours of technical assistance. We have to create a learning organization, and we also have to build learning organizations in our partners in Africa. We have to equip them to understand what results are coming out of those projects and design future projects that are better. Fifth point, we think we should make increased private investment a key measure of success at the country and regional levels in Africa, and by investment by foreign firms, the U.S., others, region-based in Africa, and country-based businesses, but really putting a focus on increasing private investment. 6, we want to prioritize local capacity building for both individuals and institutions. So we're strong supporters of the Hector program and many other kinds of capacity building programs. This really has to be like a river running through all of our programs. And finally, participants talked a lot about the weakness right now in telling the story to the U.S. and also to the African public about the importance of agriculture and food security, why it's important, and then what are we doing to address it, and informing all of us about progress along the way. I think that the Millennium Challenge Corporation has some lessons to teach us in this regard, in how you establish a pretty transparent environment where it's easy for folks to log on to the internet, find out where projects are, even where contracts are. But we need that kind of information, but we also need a storyline, almost a journalistic, Jay, approach to help the U.S. public continue to understand and appreciate why it's important for the U.S. to continue its leadership in this area. How much more time do I have? 1 minute. Oh, my gosh. Okay. All right. Well, I hope that let me just talk about a couple more things, and then I hope you all will give me your business card so I can send you the policy brief when it's ready later this week. Okay, we talked about regional economic integration. One of the other interesting ideas I think that came out of the conference was the idea of, well, how do you build a culture of U.S. government staff working together collaboratively and not competitively? So one of the ideas that came out was the idea of expanding existing USAID regional offices in Nairobi, Accra, and Pretoria to house what would become multi-agency hubs for lead staff from these various agencies, from state, from USAID, from MCC, USDA, Treasury, all those. And then these teams of Africa-based staff would work together. They'd learn to work together. They'd learn about each other's programs, and they'd be available to provide technical assistance to embassies, missions, country partners, and multilateral and bilateral agencies to develop what would be the U.S. response to African-owned implementation plans. We talked about the importance, so that's one idea. We talked about the importance of the U.S. being able to respond to regional initiatives and not just bilateral. You heard Ann talk, and we are firm believers that in Africa's not going anywhere if we continue to work just at the country level. You know, we have to be able to assist Africa's efforts to integrate regionally, to build bigger markets. Private investors don't have that much incentive to invest if they're only looking at a country market. They really need access to a regional market. So the Food Security Initiative, our efforts really need to be able to work with, as well as country governments, also be able to work with COMESA, the Common Market for East and Southern Africa, with the Southern Africa Development Community, the other regional economic communities, as well as some of the emerging partners that we're seeing. There's a beginning movement of spatial development corridors. You know, just as we have in the U.S. and Michigan, there's the Life Sciences Corridor. Collaborations between states to build a particular economic development theme. We're beginning to see this emergent in Africa as well. So we think that the Food Security Initiative should support these kind of emerging efforts as well. Okay, I'm getting the hook. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me open it up for questions. I'll try and recognize everybody. The briefer the question or comment, the better, because all of you got to go back to work despite this fascinating subject, and we want to get everybody in who wants to speak. So who wishes to be first? All right, good. Please identify yourself, and then we'll know who you are.
You can just wait for the microphone. Oh, great. Thank you. Hi, my name is Roxanne. I'm with the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW. And I want to thank you all for the very comprehensive presentation. This was really informative. My question is mostly for Anne. I know that the role of women in the strategy is very important to all of the various U.S. agencies that are working on crafting it. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how women are integrated, particularly in the forthcoming results framework. Thank you.
No, it was for you, so go ahead and do it.
So that was,
Is this on when you talk into it? Is it?
so that was the part of the presentation I didn't get to. Women are a huge priority. They are 70% of the farmers in developing countries, and we feel like they have not been integrated into earlier efforts. That a lot of times women's programs are sort of set off over here, and they're not treated as part of the sort of mainstream of agricultural producers. I'm not a specific gender expert, so I don't want to go into too much detail except to say that it's almost like what Julie said about capacity building. It has to be a river that goes through every single thing we're doing. So when we're talking about research, one of the indicators we're looking at when we decide which kinds of research streams we're going to be pursuing is what is the impact on women? What crops are women growing that will be affected by the research that we're proposing to do. And so that will cut across all of the specific pieces of this strategy. And so it's not just going to be, women are over here, or we're only going to worry about women farmers, because women also tend to be a lot of the small business owners and traders. So it's going to cut across that piece of it too.
Question in the back. Can you wait for the mic when we get it? We'll get you around and identify yourself.
Kathleen Kurz from AED, Africa's Health in 2010. Thanks very much for the comments. I wanted to pick up on the coordination, with the whole of government and the methods for coordination, and just ask if we can get a few examples from Anne and from maybe Julie as a part of the recommendation to have more at the regional USAID offices. How would they then coordinate? Because there's still huge. If coordination could be improved, our work and the work of our counterparts in countries would be a lot easier to do. Thanks.
So I'll just give a quick example, and Julie can talk about her recommendation. Let me talk about Haiti, because I think it's very current and on all of our minds. So Haiti was certainly a priority of the secretaries for its own reasons, but then also a priority as part of Feed the Future. So last summer, before the earthquake happened, we deployed multi-departmental teams, which were comprised of USAID, State, Department of Interior, USDA, to go down and work with the Haitians to develop a strategy for their agriculture sector, but also for other parts of their economy. So that process was already ongoing. Since the earthquake, we actually were just down this past week. We have had USDA and USAID teams working with State to assess the damage, to assess the situation in Haiti, and to figure out what the priorities are now. Given the earthquake, what should we be doing in agriculture, both in the short term and the long term? There was last week, I think I was getting emails from our staff at 1 a.m. That were working with USAID on developing this strategy. We just came back from a meeting where all of those groups were working together and communicating together about what we're going to do to support the government of Haiti going forward. So I think it's a really good example, and particularly because we're in such a crisis mode, that we're all working together very closely. So, and MCC, I shouldn't forget, MCC. So.
Julie, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Quickly. So I think we're all impressed with the way that the interagency process is going. I mean, the fact that people are working together. But in our discussions What's missing is leadership and clear authorities, and we think that it's very, very important to have that. So our recommendations are at 3 different levels. First is appoint the USAID administrator as the lead coordinator of the Food Security Initiative here in Washington, and make USAID the lead coordinating entity. Then at the regional level, to have this group of technical backstops, that comprises the multi-agency folks who work together, get to know one another's programs, can be dispatched to the different countries' missions, and can provide some. And part of this is really, to get around the short term, we hope, real scarcity of technical skills that we have right now. So that would be one way. Then at the country level, that I didn't get to this recommendation, but kind of mirroring what goes on in Washington. Give the ambassador convenes the U.S. agency group, but the operational lead is USAID. So, and that's how it works. And they draw on the regional technical people.
Hi, thank you. Dawn Moncrief with A Well-Fed World. We're a nonprofit based in D.C. And Anne, in particular, you had mentioned the increased meat demand, 40 to 70%. And you mentioned meat as well as vegetables, but it is primarily the meat-based consumption that's going to be causing the pressure on the global food supplies. And so I'm wondering if there's any talk of reducing that in the high-income countries. So there's a lot of talk about the low-income countries increasing their consumption of meat, but there's very little talk about the high-income countries reducing our excessive consumption to try to take some of that pressure off and free up some supplies more. And also the supply and demand, how that increased consumption for livestock and animal products actually causes a lot of pressure and increases the prices on the basic staples, so that supply and distribution are very connected in that regard. Thank you.
You want to answer that one? Yeah.
So we're not talking about trying to decrease meat consumption in the rich countries. I think, one, we all live in very consumer-oriented private sector economies, and to try to, for the U.S. government to be dictating what people eat, I think is the wrong approach. I think we are seeing, and we are going to be investing in ways to increase the efficiency of livestock production. There's a huge gap in what is potential efficiency in terms of poultry, pork, beef production, particularly in developing countries. So I think that's one way we're going to be able to kind of reduce the pressure you talked about in terms of the livestock production cycle. I'll just say the other piece of this, which is related but a bit separate to food security, we, along with New Zealand, are launching what we're calling a Global Research Alliance in greenhouse gas mitigation in agriculture. Obviously, livestock are a huge issue there, and we are going to be partnering with New Zealand and about, I think, 25 or 30 other countries to work together to find ways to reduce greenhouse gas mitigations, both in extensive livestock production systems like they have in New Zealand and the more intensive livestock systems that we have here in the U.S. and in Holland and other countries.
Got a question in the front here.
Thank you. Claiborne Crane with the House Ag Committee. Very good information. Some of it very exciting. Even as old as I am, there's some of it I hadn't heard before. Concur completely with your comments on the need for leadership at the top and coordination. My experience has been there's also a tremendous need for leadership at the grassroots level. None of these programs, no matter how good they are will work if there's not some on-the-ground leadership really in the local community, going past the state and the regional, but getting down to it. How do you do it?
That's a good question. Julie, you want to take that? Particularly among women.
Thanks. Okay, well, that is a good question, and thanks for it. I want to approach that both on the U.S. side and the Africa side. I think one of the amazing things that I've witnessed over the past several years is the emergence of a grassroots constituency in the U.S. For agriculture and food security in developing countries. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Foods Resource Bank, which is a Christian group that essentially dedicates land in a community, collects resources, and actually plays a role in sensitizing farmers and their communities on agricultural needs, often leads trips abroad. I think they've really started something that's beginning to take off, a real core of support in the Midwest. So that's very important. So that kind of leadership by Foods Resource Bank, by the Chicago Council, by many others has created that here. In Africa, I think we also know that this leadership, civil society leadership, is very important, but we have to sort of go a step back and help strengthen the capacity. So, I mean, that's why we're emphasizing in these recommendations, which I hope we can send you a copy of, why we look at capacity building as being more than training PhD researchers, as important as that is. But it's also looking back and saying, well, what does it take to energize a civil society component in a country to work on these issues? And I think, our civil society community here in the U.S. and in Africa and in Europe has been vocal in making sure that the NGO community, nascent as it is, remains involved in discussions in the ground, in these the compact discussions in Africa. So I think that's my caution there. Completely agree with you, but it's not easy as saying you'll be included, because people have to be strengthened first.
Gentleman in the back's been patiently waiting. Start you right here. Yeah, all the way in the back, right in front of the camera.
Yeah, thank you. Paul Ndiho, Voice of America. I will start with you, Anna. You talked about agriculture-led growth as the most efficient way to increase income for the poor. I was wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit more in detail what you mean by that. And Julie, you talked about the importance of food security. I was wondering that you said that for some reason you've not been able to tell the story. I was wondering, when you go out there, do you engage the local farmers or you just talk to the policymakers? Thank you.
Either of you can respond first.
That's a very important point on telling the story, and that was another one of sort of the wildfire things that came out of our conference, people being very concerned. We're a tiny organization. I mean, our brief really is to work on U.S. policy and programs and align them better with African priorities to make them more effective, and to surface issues like this, that we're not telling the story adequately either in U.S. circles or in African circles. One of the interesting presentations we had during the conference was from an African journalist, a South African journalist who's leading a South African broadcasting corporation series on farming and agriculture. So her views on what it takes and sort of the dissonance often in views, not only between developing country aid implementers and farmers, but I mean she sees the same thing in South Africa as well. So I think we really have to get better at many different levels and learn how to reach out to communities and farmers and use the variety of social media that are increasingly available. In Africa, radio as well as the internet as well as cell phones. All these things I think really have not been tapped yet. So I think you're absolutely right. Include farmers, especially women, the majority of farmers.
So the main reason that agriculture is such an effective tool for reducing poverty and reducing hunger is about 70% of the poor are farmers, and they live in rural areas. Most of them are not self-sufficient. They're subsistence farmers or low-resource farmers, and they don't have enough money to even to buy the food that they can't grow. So one of the pathways through which agriculture helps improve people's incomes is, one, it helps increase their productivity and increase their ability to sell, one, to produce enough food for themselves to eat, but also to sell some surplus into the market. Secondly, and maybe more importantly, is that as I said, we often forget that most of these farmers are not producing enough food, and they are all consuming in the marketplace. And so as you're increasing productivity, increasing the efficiency of the ag sector, you're also reducing food prices, so it makes food more affordable to people in developing countries. I mean, you imagine, right, in the U.S., I think the statistics are we spend about 12% of our income on food, right? Now, if people here were spending 50, 60, 70% of their income on food, they wouldn't have enough money to buy health care, they wouldn't have enough money to buy education, to buy clothes, all of the things that we associate with not being poor. And I think that's the other piece of this, is that agriculture or food as a share of people's consumption starts going down, and they can start buying housing, education for their kids. Most of the education in developing countries is not free. So I think there are a number of pathways.
Ann made a very important point, by the way. They're out on the table for those of you who are interested. The Wilson Center ran a conference on this several years ago. What's the impact of trade liberalization on poverty? And the short answer is it all depends upon whether you produce a surplus crop so you can sell it, or whether you're going to buy in the market, because you can't make it through the year without adequate food. And it's an important finding that varies widely by country. You've been waiting patiently.
Blake Selzer with CARE, and Jay hasn't had a chance to say anything in this talk. So actually, this is more of a comment than even a question. So no, it's good. It's more of a comment. We're thrilled. CARE is strongly behind your boss's bill, and we're glad that you're working with the administration to get something through. I'd say one thing we really need is, as you mentioned, in the current small island of bipartisanship, in a sea of partisanship. So the more your boss can work with President Obama, because he seems to have a good relationship, is incredible. If there's any staff in this room that work for particularly the minority side, we could use more sponsors of S384 or whatever the bill may end up being. So I just encourage strong support for that. And a quick point on, we also support, you mentioned some of the concerns in the bill. There are also groups that support some of those provisions, like the flexible approach and local regional purchase, and we're one of them. So thanks.
Respond, but I'd like to ask you, and I'm not sure you said it, but I don't think you did quite, what the prospects are for the bill, and how much dialogue are you running with the administration?
Well, thank you for the support of my boss. I think the bill has very good prospects, relatively speaking, in the U.S. Senate. Very relatively good means who knows what it means. I think the problem has been we have to get floor time. I think we have to run the traps with all the different interest groups and so on and so forth. But I think we're in a much better position now than we were a few months ago, because I think we've come to full engagement with the administration, and I think we're going to get a bipartisan effort. And I think at the end of the day, I think probably one of the biggest problems is going to be how much money can we put into it. I mean, in this straitened budget environment, our hope is to get the funding levels for support of agriculture back to where they were in the 1980s. As we've all mentioned here, agriculture support has dropped, for development. So if we can get it back up to the level, whether we're able to do that, I think that's going to be one of the toughest parts, because everyone knows the situation here in Washington. But aside from that, but I think the principles are pretty well there. I don't see any deal breakers on the table. I think we have to haggle and get things through. But I think if we get a consensus bill, I think we could get floor time in the Senate. I think the House probably can get it through. But the Senate is always, of course, the wild card.
We're running. You want a quickie? Okay, go ahead. Quick, because we're running out of time.
No, I just wanted to reiterate how important the support of the partnership, really, for this work of Senator Lugar, Senator Casey, and Congressman McCollum to work with the administration, and why that's important. And I think Jay's exactly right in what he said. I mean, really trying to reestablish this as a pillar of U.S. foreign policy is incredibly important. I mean, because otherwise we're kind of back to the battles that some of you know too well, year by year, appropriation by appropriation. And the problem with it is that many of the problems we face, and we have to solve our long-term problems, like infrastructure, like capacity building. These are not things that can be done with 1 or 2 year appropriations. They really require the kind of vision that we're seeing in the Lugar-Casey bill and in the administration's bill. So very, very important. We'll put a high priority on sewing these together.
I'm sensitive to everybody's time, so let's take a couple, let's say 3 last questions. The gentleman there in the blue tie, and then the lady in the back.
My name is John McMurray from USAID. My question is sort of following on the gentleman right there. It's for Jay, so I'm going to give you a second one here. You said, one of the issues you raised was, this idea of limiting this local regional purchase of food aid to the emergency situations. I'm wondering if there is any room to sort of move some of that local regional purchase to what you would call more chronic food aid, if there's anything that's amenable to the commodities people here. I think this has been tried. They've looked at doing food aid models this way, of doing more local regional purchase for, on a more conventional things to prevent some of the market distortions you have from flooding the market. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Can you pass it to the person in the back of you there? I'll let people respond to the question. Go ahead.
Now, let me just say quickly, we didn't really want to reopen the local regional purchase issue. We didn't. That's one of the things that kind of tripped us up, because we didn't really want to go there. We just have extra money. It's new money, no year money for under the existing rules, and we didn't want to, because it's such a battle, as everyone knows. So that's for another day.
Go ahead.
Melissa Ho with the Congressional Research Service. So of the $1 billion plus requested by the administration for fiscal year 2011 for this initiative, a large portion, over $400 million of non-food aid, is actually going to the World Bank for the trust fund that is set up by the G8. So my question first to Jay, again, and then also to Anne and Julie, is to what extent does your boss, and to what the extent you can speak for the Foreign Relations Committee, support that proposal of those funds going to the World Bank? And then to Anne and Julie, is there an expectation from the U.S. government and the administration that other countries, the G8, the G20, are also going to give a substantial amount of money to the trust fund at the bank? And then how does the plans and programs of the bank coincide with the administration's overall implementation plan and strategy for this initiative?
One last question over here, but your question was very good because it points out the fact that it's Treasury Department that instructs the World Bank. And it's a big question whether USAID or the State Department will have much say in it.
You want us to answer that question later?
Yeah, you can answer them all together. And you can choose not to answer the ones you don't want to answer.
Catherine Coleman with the Manoff Group. We work on another part of food security, which is at the community level, specifically community nutrition. And I'm wondering what role nutrition or community work plays in the policy and legislation that you're talking about.
In the interest of time, I don't want to cut this off, by the way, and I'm sure that the speakers will be willing to answer questions individually, but let's let the panelists respond in turn, but reverse the order and start with Julie. And that gives you the last word. So
Okay, on the Treasury, the World Bank question, we support that fund because we think it's important to say that the U.S. is supporting multilateral efforts. I believe Anne can confirm this. There have already been commitments ahead of our governments to the World Bank Fund. One thing we do want to say is that okay, I mean, yes, it is going to be administered through Treasury, with oversight of the World Bank. So there will have to be given some thought, and there is being thought given to what is going to be the advisory committee, the composition of the advisory committee. And we would also say, and it's going to come out in these recommendations, that we have to have some way to make sure that Treasury is liaising very, very closely with the multi-agency group, so that you see that the funds are actually used, for example, in Africa, to fund the CADP, the country plans. So I think that's quite important. Nutrition has been a very important part of this, the food security initiative, and I think you'll see it prominently in all the documents. I'm bucking this to Anne, who can explain more thoroughly. But I think that it's a high and it's a well-deserved priority.
I can't.
The one message is get your member to sign up.
I can't give you an authoritative answer. You should talk to Connie Viet and our staff about whether. I think Senator Lugar's fine with that administration proposal. We do a lot of oversight of the World Bank, and we're very cognizant of what goes on there, and we have our issues with him. But I think he's fine with that. And I think also we have added actually between the first iteration of our bill and the second, we added a nutrition component. A bunch of us went out to the field. I went to Laos and the Philippines to do a field investigation, and I came back from Laos convinced that we had to make nutrition an important part of the element. So that's in our bill as well.
And the last word is yours.
Yeah, great. So on the World Bank Trust Fund, we are actively soliciting additional contributions from other countries. In fact, had a discussion about this the other day, because we don't want it to just be 2 or 3 countries that are making that contribution. There will be an interagency team that is working with the Treasury Department to make sure that the World Bank is aligning with what we all want to see. The criteria and the indicators that the World Bank is going to be using for their investments are, big surprise, exactly the same ones that we're using for the Feed the Future initiative. So that's one way we're trying to help align what they're going to be doing with the rest of the investments that are going to be made around this initiative. And as I say, there will be active engagement of state and USAID and probably to a lesser extent USDA in what the World Bank is going to be doing. On nutrition, absolutely, that was another piece of my talk that I skipped over. For those of you who don't know, half of all childhood deaths to disease in developing countries are malnutrition contributes to half of all deaths of children in developing countries. Many developing countries lose about 3% of their GDP because of hunger and malnourishment. So it is an absolutely critical piece of the initiative. And I also failed to mention earlier there's a woman from the global health part of USDA who has been actively working with us to develop our nutrition strategy, and we're going to be working very closely with the global health people, which is where nutrition has been placed up until now. In addition to sort of the community level approaches of improving nutrition and nutritional quality, we're also focusing on making sure that people have a diversified diet. So it's a production side issue as well as sort of the education and being treated as more of a health issue, if you will.
Just a note of perspective on this. Those of us with gray beards and gray hair in this room will remember that there was a distinguished Secretary of State who promised in a public speech at the Rome World Food Conference that no child would go to bed hungry by 1995. And it shows you how far we've come and how far we have to go on what is really one of the great critical issues of a world which we'd all like to live in, a better world. So let me ask you to thank our speakers. That was a very informative one. And I thank you all.